Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Student Spotlight series, where we showcase some of the work our past students have done. My name is Michael Tong, and today it is our pleasure to have Rachel Lee with us. So could you tell us a bit about yourself, where you're from, where you're going to school, and what year you're in, and a little bit about the course you took with CCIR?
Yeah. Hello, my name is Rachel Lee. I live in Singapore. I'm Korean, and I'm a senior at Singapore American School. And I did the CCIR one-on-one mentorship program with Dr. Alice Baldock. And I did research on sociology and history.
Yeah. So can you tell us a bit about how you became interested in the program?
Yeah, so initially, at the time that I applied for the program, I was taking a class called AP Research, which is a full course, a year-long course designed to teach students how to go about the research process and create a final product of a 5,000-word paper and a 20-minute presentation of the paper to submit to the College Board, which is the institution that's responsible for keeping track of AP scores in the American system. And I did research on women in politics and perceived efficacy on women in politics. So I knew I definitely wanted to spend my summer doing a little more of a deep dive into women and some of the historical things that women have faced in the United States. So that drew me to doing some research on Reddit and YouTube on some possible online research programs, which led me to CCIR.
Okay, great. So you came in already with the topic in mind. You wanted to do more research on women in politics, or did it end up being a different sort of topic?
Yeah, so initially I did think that I was going to do more research on women in politics. The topic I ended up choosing is not exactly the same thing. And that kind of came naturally as Dr. Baldock and I did some more brainstorming on some potential topics that we could research.
I see. So that's actually a good sort of segue then, because what I also wanted to ask was about how the program was structured. I guess how did you sort of get to know your mentor, and then what kind of, well, yeah, how was the learning structured, and how did you maybe work together to create that structure?
Yeah, initially we met for our first meeting where we just kind of got to know each other and each other's interests. So I did some research on Dr. Baldock and the work she had done previously. And upon doing so, I realized that she specialized in research on East Asian women and a lot about Japanese culture and a dance. So I thought it would probably be interesting to do research with an East Asian focus because, well, I'm East Asian, I live in Asia, and it's very relevant to my experience. But also, since I had done research more broadly on women in politics previously, I thought it would be interesting to maybe narrow my topic even more to a specific ethnic group.
I see.
And yeah, the first meeting we had, we mainly just brainstormed and I introduced myself and my academic interests, sort of similar to how I'm doing right now. And she gave me some ideas, and one thing led to the next, and we decided on a topic relatively quickly. I think in the first two meetings, we decided our topic. And then we talked about potential methodologies and how I wanted to go about doing the research. And I think we spent a pretty decent amount of time on the planning part. And then maybe around lesson 4 or 5, we started talking about writing introductions and literature reviews and actually getting started on the paper, which is what we dedicated the remainder of the course to doing.
So can you say a little bit about what, I guess, what the specific topic you settled on was?
Yeah, so I'll pull it up right here. I wanted to do research on the Page Law's effect on Chinese women's safety and lived experiences in the United States between the years of 1848 and 1943. So the Page Law is a lesser known immigration law in the United States, and I've taken AP US history and we never discussed it because it's often overshadowed by the Chinese Exclusion Act. But it is I believe it is the first US law that targeted a specific ethnic group from immigrating to the United States. And it was more so targeted towards Chinese or East Asian women. And I wanted to do research on how this law affected the lived experiences of the Chinese women who were seeking refuge or a job in the United States, because oftentimes history focuses more on logistics and less so on the lived experiences of people who were the stakeholders of certain legislation.
Sure. So can you say a little bit more about what that law was exactly, and maybe just give an intro to the kind of impact that you were focusing on?
Yeah, so the law is structured in a couple different parts, and the language used in the law was pretty vague. So it talks about, they use words like Oriental and alien, and sort of talking about preventing people from coming to the US with ulterior motives, and that motive being like engaging in sex work or sort of modern day slavery, as was perceived. And the law was kind of a result of a growing anti-immigration sentiment and B, an anti-slavery sentiment. So that's one of the things I talk about in my paper. After slavery had been abolished, like the timeline of the abolition of slavery and the 13th Amendment very closely overlaps with the passage of the Page Law after the Civil War. So it's probably like more of a correlation thing as to why the law was accepted at the time. The law didn't last very long. It was eventually repealed and instead substituted with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is more explicit in its language, sort of preventing communism from coming to the United States. But in general, the law was unfair, rooted a lot in racial stereotypes, and the law also had a lot of implications. Like if you look at Hollywood at the time, Hollywood sort of had like a golden age in the next few decades. And if you see a lot of popular productions like Miss Saigon, they feature this trope of a hypersexualized Asian character who is almost the side part to the white male protagonist. And I do believe, as a result of doing my research and from my previous hypotheses, that the Page Law framing East Asian women coming into the United States in such a light, such a hypersexualized light, played a large role in this kind of portrayal in Hollywood.
I see. So you mentioned that the focus was on lived experience, right? Could you share a little bit about what maybe your research led you to on that front?
Yeah, so in order to learn about lived experiences, the best way I believed to go about it was by going through testimonies. So admittedly, there weren't very many sources about the Page Law because it's something that is just not as discussed in literature. So I found a book by Judy Young. It's called Unbound Voices, and it highlights the experience of the Chinese migrant to the United States over quite a long timeline. So I had to go through the book and search for testimonies, letters that were written by these Chinese women within the timeline that I had chosen. And it was a lot of interviews that these women were given, maybe by immigration officers, background checks. And there was quite a large spectrum of testimonies, but there were also some accounts about like treatment once they've arrived at the United States. And that's mainly what I wanted to focus on, sort of the process and experience of the Chinese women from the port all the way to the mainland.
Could you maybe share some of the experiences that you came across in your research that stuck with you or seemed especially noteworthy?
Yeah, the findings were not all that surprising because, it's implied that with discriminatory laws, the people who are the subject of the laws will probably face discriminatory practices and treatment from people in the land that they're going to. And that was, in fact, the case. Discrimination was very prevalent for Chinese women arriving to the United States. But it's more so I also wanted to look at, like, find evidence of people being discriminatory as a result of the law. So there were there's a lot of discussion from Americans who had been living in the United States at the time, talking about how Chinese women are indecent and immoral and how they're victims of modern day slavery. And one particularly interesting thing was there was a really large evangelical culture at the time. So a lot of these female missionaries would be going door to door and have this whole front of being very pro-woman and for women's rights and being very against slavery. And they would go on these missions to preach about how the Chinese woman in the United States needs to be saved because of the things that they've witnessed happening in these brothels. So they would talk about mutilation and abuse, and they would use very strong, provocative language. And they would put these in newspapers and publications to make it known to the public that the Chinese woman was oppressed. And the ultimate effect that this ended up having was people believed that because Chinese women were being mistreated in the United States, it'd be better not to bring them in general, which is why they faced even more resistance at the ports, with immigration officers conducting very targeted interrogations about background, about marriage, children, intent for immigration.
Yeah. It's interesting because I wasn't aware of this law, but I did earlier this year do some research on the history of Chinatown in Lower Manhattan. And one thing that I came across was that it was more difficult for Chinese women or East Asian women to immigrate than East Asian men. And the result was a community that was very much a bachelor community, especially post-Chinese Exclusion Act. It was a community that was mostly single men, and that very much shaped, I think, a lot of the dynamics surrounding, just the lives of Chinese immigrants in Chinatown and Manhattan. But I hadn't realized that, I guess, that this law might have been very much in the background there. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I think that might be true. And sort of in a similar but different vein, during the gold rush, which happened right before the influx of Chinese immigration to the United States started happening, it was largely a bachelor community as well, because it's typically the men who were moving westward to mine gold and try to make a living for their family, whether that be by inviting them later or by going back to the East. And that sort of generated a demand for sex workers, especially foreign sex workers. And yeah, it's interesting how gender dynamics and demographics within areas can influence politics and sort of interactions between different groups of people.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So you mentioned that a lot of what you found was in a way not surprising, which is to say that maybe you didn't have the, I guess, the concrete evidence in place, but you kind of knew what you were looking for and you found it. Did you find anything that did surprise you, or that did kind of change the perspective that you had maybe going in when you began doing the research?
I would say the most surprising thing would probably go back to the female missionaries I talked about earlier, because when I took history classes, we did learn about the rise of evangelical culture and the people who promoted anti-slavery and stood for women's rights. And we learned about them in a very positive light. They were the protagonists of the stories that we were learning about. But upon doing research through the lens of the people who were coming to the United States and allegedly being helped by these people, it's clear to see that it was very much a facade, because these women had a lot of, the female missionaries had a lot of background of being very racist and phobic, and that's just not something that's talked about in history books. And I was surprised to find such blatant evidence of their racism, because they wrote about it very openly in these publications that they would submit to. And I think that was surprising for sure, only because you don't really learn about that in textbook history courses.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I associate a lot with the early 20th century progressive movement. I don't know if that's kind of the era that you were looking at. Is that, or were you looking earlier than that?
I did look up till 1943, so yes, that would be within the
Yeah.
range.
Yeah, which is to say that there's definitely a way of attempting to provide aid that also stigmatizes the people that you're attempting to help, and maybe that's already a very charitable way of interpreting what was going on. But definitely there's a way of portraying oneself as someone interested in helping a certain, victimized or underserved population that actually also, in a way, victimizes that population or perpetuates a certain stigma about them. And that definitely seems like part of what you're describing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Couldn't have said it better. Like offering aid in a way that stigmatizes the group that's being helped would be correct.
So I imagine you've wrote and finished a paper then on the basis of the research that you've done, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So what was the writing experience like? I mean, I guess what were the challenges that you faced? What kind of support maybe did you receive during the writing process?
Yeah, that's a good question. Initially, one of the things I was seeking out when I looked into the program was someone to give me detailed feedback
Mhm.
because taking AP research was very fulfilling. Something I'd done before. It felt a bit more natural and clean. But Dr. Baldock was very meticulous in her feedback. She would look for, like, down to the word. She would give me advice on the best way to convey my message. And in general, the writing process it felt very smooth to me. There were challenges because the methodology I used was a literary and cultural. Uh, but yeah, she gave me a lot of resources on like etymology and on tracing Latin roots. That was very helpful for me when writing my paper. But the actual writing itself, I did not think it was difficult at all.
Mhm. I guess so. You felt like, I guess, the process of doing research prepared you for writing in a way that made it. I mean, basically, you were just writing what you'd already found and thought out doing the research.
Not necessarily. I think taking a course in research previously gave me the foundation to be able to um, I had an understanding of what a literature review is supposed to have in it, and I knew the different signposting I should use and how to reference sources and build a paper. But knowing that did um, give us more time. It permitted us more time to focus on more details and to actually focus on the study itself rather than the technical things about writing a paper. So I thought it was a really great use of time.
I see. That's actually very helpful. That helps me understand better. So I guess your previous experience meant that you already knew how to write a paper, so you could really just focus on mostly on just doing the research and then working out the details, I suppose.
Yeah, and it was fantastic because in AP research, one of the guidelines is that you have to borrow a methodology from a seminal source.
Mhm.
But Dr. Baldock gave me full control over the methodology I could use. And we sort of worked together in designing an original methodology, which I'm sure is not entirely original, but it wasn't something that I copied off of another paper or
I
took
see.
direct inspiration from. And it was great. I felt like I had a lot of autonomy over my own study.
Mhm.
And it felt like it really felt like my own paper, which was wonderful.
Yeah, that is great. I think that you've said a little bit about it, but maybe do you think you could say maybe a little more formally what your methodology was?
Yeah, I'll read it exactly as I wrote in my paper.
Okay.
So I used a closed text, cultural, and literary analysis, and focusing on how language and rhetoric used in written media before, during, and after the page law's affected Chinese women's safety and lived experiences in the United States. So
That's-
what I did was go through the original page law. I went through a Senate account. So it's written by the California Senate. It's a very long primary source. I also went through the testimonies from Judy Young's book. And what I did was I would go through little excerpts from the text, look up specific language that was used. One that comes to mind immediately would be Oriental. It's a word that is controversial and has a lot of history in it. And I would look at the roots and sort of the trend of how it was used and sort of thinking about the denotation and connotation of these words and how that might have been interpreted by the general public who was reading the Senate account or the law, and what kind of impression that gives on people. Because legal papers, in my opinion, have a lot of gravity to them because they're issued by the highest power in the country, and so people take it seriously. So if the government is calling a certain group of people and using language to describe them, that's likely to be taken seriously by people and therefore have an impact on the way they are perceived and treated. So that was mainly my goal, was to go through and analyze the language and rhetoric of these excerpts.
I see. Yeah, that's helpful. So the focus was on specifically how the language that was used in your sort of written sources impacted the lived experience of East Asian women. Would that be accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So do you plan to publish the paper or take it to any conferences? Do you already have something like that in the works?
Yeah, I reached out to the CCIR team after I published my paper, and they sent me my evaluation and a list of journals and conferences that I might consider publishing to. And I definitely have looked into some of these journals. They're similar journals that I've looked into for publishing my previous paper that I admittedly have not gotten around to doing yet. But I do intend on publishing my paper at some point because I think it's important for more people to understand a law, because even though it's been repealed for many, many decades, I still think that the impacts live on today.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you talked a little bit about the impact that you feel like this law had on media, right? And especially, media from the Hollywood golden age, which still is sort of enshrined today as, many of these movies rather are enshrined today as classics, right? So that kind of, the presentation of East Asian women in those movies certainly has a far-ranging impact that, persists today.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
So yeah, that's great. I'm glad that you're working on getting it published. Do you have any more sort of overall thoughts about your experience with the program that you'd like to share?
I think I was really, really fortunate because Dr. Baldock, her interests aligned with mine completely. I didn't necessarily express at the time of my interviews that I wanted to look into East Asian women and migration to the United States. I more so gave context on my previous research and just some thoughts that I had of how I might expand on that. So I got very fortunate with the matching. So I think maybe if I were to give advice to someone who might do this program in the future, it would be to spend adequate time thinking about what they want to research,
I see.
so that the pairing might be, it may not just be luck based. We might be, like, the program might be able to pair the researcher to a professor who can best support their research endeavors.
Mhm.
And and also because Dr. Baldock, she trusted my vision and gave me a lot of trust during the process. So she mainly kept her hands off, which I personally really appreciated because it gave me a chance to grow as a researcher. So yeah, overall the experience was very, very much positive, and I would recommend it to anyone who's looking to explore an academic interest.
Yeah. So it seems in a way like maybe the core of your experience had to do with the specific relationship that you had with Dr. Baldock. Is that what you mean? Or like, which is to say that you found a good mentor, it was a good match, you worked well together, and that really seems to have made the experience in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Aside from just writing, we also had a lot of conversations about some of the research she had done. She recommended me different readings I could do out on my free time. And it didn't feel like a class. It was more like a conversation. So it was engaging, and I looked forward to the sessions every week.
Mhm. That's great. So is there anything, I guess as a last question, is there anything that you wish you had known earlier that if you were talking to someone who's going to do a program like this, you would want to tell them?
There weren't very many things that caught me by surprise when I was doing the program. Like, oh, I wish I had known that earlier. I think I arrived pretty prepared, and the team has been super accommodating anytime there was extenuating circumstances or a need for a schedule change. So was Dr. Baldock. She was very accommodating of that. So overall, I would say it was a pretty bump-free experience.
Yeah, that's great. It definitely sounds to me like you knew what you were looking for coming in and you got it basically.
I
Uh,
did, yeah. It was very
yeah.
rewarding.
So yeah, that's great. I'm really glad you had a good experience. The paper you wrote sounds really interesting. I'd certainly be interested in reading it if it does get published, or even if it doesn't, I guess. But yeah, I thank you so much for sharing about your experience and about the research that you were doing. I guess one more question that just occurs to me. I feel like maybe the answer is a little obvious, but do you feel like this experience has prepared you well to continue doing research in the future, or take on a similar or a more ambitious project in the future?
Yeah, I think so. And I think sometimes research can make you feel fatigued, but this research felt very energizing. And I'm planning on studying sociology or government in the future uh, when I go to university. And part of the reason that I want to study sociology, and this is something that I reflected a lot about as I went about the application process, was because of the research that I did with Dr. Baldock. It made me realize that I am very interested in demographic and gender studies and race and migration patterns in the United States. And this is a new window. Like, I had not really looked into this specifically in the past, though I did a lot of work on politics and women.
Mhm.
So it was very inspiring, and it gave me a chance to think about an academic discipline that I had not before. So I would be very much excited to continue doing research on similar topics when I pursue further education.
That's great. I feel like in some ways that's the most important thing, that I guess you're prepared to continue doing the work. So yeah, I'm very glad to hear that. Yeah, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing about your work. It was very interesting, and I really enjoyed hearing about it. And I wish you the best of luck in your, future research.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me.